matchup against Self-Reliance earlier, the boys are looking very strong coming in.
That's right, and let's not count out Pain for Femme as well, because they're so close together in their time trials there, Nagra.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this dungeon, specifically because it was a time trial match, I think it can go to anyone at this point, even though maybe the boys were slightly more consistent compared to Pain for Femme, but Pain for Femme showed some very good times as well, as I mentioned earlier, so I think this can really go to either of those teams.
Alright, well let's see as the game number 1 is ready to go in our lower semis in Freehold.
We see both teams actually doing a pull at the very start here. Now this is something not every team does. Sometimes you see a skip here at the start and then we see a pull in the first boss area. So interesting to see that both of these teams choose to do one of these earlier pulls. Now this is a difficult one because of Bolstering.
Yeah, and I mean, so far, both of them are dealing with it incredibly well. Just a little tiny bit of bolstering going on these mobs, like almost negligible. These bosses are at about 10 to 20% HP when bolstering even starts, so, you know, they're doing really well.
I agree. I mean, we see the Crackshot here is a little bit bolstered. Now, unfortunately, that is a mob that is very hard to gather up with the rest of the mobs because it's a caster. And it's just hard to move, especially if you don't have a DK for a grip or something like that. So impressive by both of them. Very, very close to each other. They are pulling the next pack as well. This is very, like, almost simultaneously running to the next pull here by both of these teams.
And you know, it kind of sucks to say, but honestly, I'm just waiting till the end of the dungeon. I just want to see, we said it in the last Freehold, I just want to see if they're going to go for the kiting strategy. We didn't see either of the previous two teams go for it, which makes sense because they haven't had that much time to practice. But both of these teams have had a little couple extra matches worth of practice time, as well as whatever they got last night, or probably this morning because they were up late last night doing the MDI. The practice they got this morning, maybe they, knew they were going to be in this Freehold and could have gotten a little bit of practice in. Because if one of them did practice it and knows how to pull it off, they'll probably win the dungeon.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we will see what they do. If they skip all of the Awaken mobs, right, then we probably know they are going to do the kiting strat, because it's super difficult to pull all of the 4 Awaken mobs with the last boss without doing the kiting. So we'll see what they do as both of the teams are engaging the first boss here. They also saved the Bloodlust for this, as it is a Tyrannical setting, so they just want to have the Bloodlust to get the boss done a little bit quicker.
Yep. And I mean, there's really not that much of a difference you can look at here. Both of them are running the double BM Hunter Rogue comp, so it's really going to come down to who gets better Dance of Death procs, which is kind of the name of the game right now. Now, of course, they do all have the exact same gear available to them. It's all vendor gear from the current raid, and as well as Eternal Palace trinkets, so, they can run the exact same setups with perfect crit corruption. So really it comes down to whether or not your Dance of Death wants to proc as the BM Hunter, and you can see across the board, the Hunters on the side of Pain for Femme are pretty even, whereas over on the boys, Petko's kind of giving Chaya a beating over here.
Yeah, and one thing to note as well is that the Mistweavers can actually do damage because of the range, because of the Hunters. Usually when you run a full melee comp, the healer needs to be the one standing outside, baiting the pool so it doesn't spawn on top of the boss, on top of the melee. But with the Hunters, they're actually free to do the baiting because they don't lose any damage from moving around. And you have the Mistweavers actually being able to do DPS, and they're doing very close to tank DPS, almost 50k for both of those Mistweavers. So a lot of damage coming out of the healers as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting to say because right now, you look at the damage breakdowns for a lot of dungeon classes, and there's so much RNG to it. There are some classes where over 50% of their damage are just random RNG chances, and that's not really what the case is for Hunters because they're stacking that percentage crit. Most of their damage just comes from their own abilities. There's not really a whole lot of random RNG to their damage outside of just getting that one Azerite trait proc that we were talking about. So, these guys are going to be really close. There's not too much RNG for them. Finishing the boss 3 seconds apart, that's kind of something we're going to see. We're going to have to see superior routing from one of the teams in order for one of them to pull significantly ahead, outside of just a mistake or people dying.
Yeah, this is super close. Almost looks like we're watching the same team just on 2 different screens as they're moving on onto the bridge here. Now we see the Rogue, at least we see Naladra be off to the side. He's not in range anymore. Probably starting that Ring of Booty NPC role-playing event. Zavek is now away as well, so I assume he's also doing the same thing. Just because when you talk to the NPC, it takes a little while before the pick spawns, so they just want to get this out of the way as soon as they can. While both of the teams are now engaging the second boss.
Yeah, I didn't really see if Naladra actually went over and did that. So he was at the boss right when they pulled it, whereas you can see on the side of Pain for Fem, Seb has not done a single point of damage because he is doing that RP like you just said. So maybe on the side of the boys, they thought that it would be better for them to do that RP that Naladra, that Seb already took care of at some point later on, just so they could get this boss down even quicker. It's an interesting choice. We'll see if it changes anything for him.
Or he left earlier. I think I remember Naladra actually, the last time they played this dungeon, they left in the middle of the first boss fight. So I'm not really sure if we missed it. Either way, we'll see later on as they go to the Ring of Booty event. And what we've also seen from those two teams in this dungeon is that they will pull some trash on top of the boss once they're a little bit lower. Because we're, of course, in a bolstering environment, so you don't want to pull trash on top at the very start, because then you just need to off-tank it until the boss dies. So that's why they pull everything a little bit later, so they can cleave down the boss and also the trash at the same time.
And once again, we're seeing that slight difference in strategy here, where the boys is opting to go for the more even cleave on the bosses, and then they'll, of course, pull trash in when the bosses are about 20%. Whereas we're seeing a little bit of a different strategy from Pain for Fem, where they'll kill one quickly and then start cleaving this one single boss down with extra trash. It's a little bit of a differing strategy, right? You get a little bit more efficiency in the terms of what the boys is doing, where you get to cleave the bosses down more evenly, but you still have more mechanics to deal with while you're pulling in that trash, so it's slightly more dangerous.
Yeah, there's also a little bit of RNG on this boss fight, which I know teams don't really like the RNG, but you can make use of all of the buffs. Now, the brew that is being thrown from the bartender, as you can see those swirlies on the ground, it can either be crit or a haste buff, which you want to take as a player, or it can be a dot, which you want to put the enemy mobs into. Now, usually the dot is the best one for you to get, because the dot does more damage than the amount of damage you would be doing as a team with the crit or the haste buff. So usually the dot is the best one to get, but we don't really see which one they get, as the boys already moving on, doing the next pull. They did finish off the boss a little bit faster compared to Pain for Fem, sorry.
Yeah, and it looks like, you would assume that Pain for Fem is behind because it took them so long to finish the boss, but they were specifically keeping the boss alive just for those buffs like you mentioned. That extra crit and haste that you can get from those barrels is a lot of extra damage that you can get, and you can see that it's going to help them take care of this trash. Now, just in terms of pure efficiency, it looks like the boys have been playing a lot better. They're dealing with their bolstering a lot better. And that trapper is huge. Look at its HP. It was at 70% with multiple bolsters on it. I'm not really sure why they want to keep this pull alive. Because the council is dead, they are able to release and finish off the trash right here. But with those bolstering stacks, is it really worth it at this point?
Especially since they have Shadow Melt, right? They could just Shadow Melt off the aggro here, not losing anyone, to reset this bolster trapper here. Also, Shella is not an idol, but he's got the Feign Death, so they could definitely reset this pull if they want to, and it seems like that's what they're doing right now. There we go, now they're out of combat. Yeah, definitely a little bit of a time loss here, having to kite around this trapper, losing some players, having 3 deaths on the board now, 36% trash only compared to the 53% of the boys. So definitely some mistakes coming in from Pain for Fem here.
And this is kind of what we were talking about pre-cast. The boys, even though they might have not had the most superior routing in every single dungeon, they've been consistently, consistent. Like almost 0 deaths, 1 death in almost every single dungeon. These guys have been playing their exact strategy with very little mistakes, and it's been working wonders for them. Obviously, if you make no mistakes and the other team makes the mistakes, unless you're going at a snail's pace to the dungeon, you're going to win.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's very impressive, to be honest, how consistent they really are, because we've talked about the boys being this #1 rated.io team on live servers for high keys last season, but for the MDI, they did compete last season, but only for the last couple of cups, and they don't have as much experience really compared to Pain for Fem. Pain for Fem has been participating in the MDI for a lot longer than the boys have, so it's very impressive to see how consistent they can really be in this tournament play, because it's very different to live servers, and it's also all the pressure and the nerves really when you have to compete in a tournament like this.
Well, also, when you look at a team like Pain for Fem, not only do they have a lot of practice from last year, but they also have MDI pedigree from previous years. Shelley played a Warlock in the 2018 MDI as part of Method PogChamp, which was the number 2 seed out of the European region, and I believe they ended up getting 3rd in that 2018 MDI season. So there's a lot of pedigree on their team, and I'm not really surprised to see them playing this well this year.
Yeah, most definitely. And we see the boys now moving on. They've dealt with the bosses already as they do some trash. Now, we've seen the strategy from multiple teams already that because of the Ring of Booty having a lot of kind of RP events in between Ludwig, in between Trothak and the pig event, there's just going to be trash pulled in between those kind of times that they need to wait. Of course, you don't just want to sit around and do nothing, and that's why it looks like they're backtracking, but in the end, there's nothing else you can do during this time. So in this very scenario, backtracking is definitely better than just sitting around doing nothing, of course.
And looking at that awakened obelisk, the boys haven't yet pulled it, so there's a chance maybe that they might go for the strategy. We'll have to see, but generally speaking, if they pull that obelisk, we know that they probably aren't going to be going for it. And also in the context of the current dungeon, with how far ahead of Paint for Femme that they are, they might want to keep it in the back pocket. If they don't pull out the strategy now and they take a freehold later on, they have that to pull out still.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is also going to be part of like how experienced you are, right? Because I think if you're ahead, like if you're really, really far ahead and the other team has like 20 deaths and they keep wiping on the first boss like Rockmora or something, I don't know, then they can definitely say, hey, okay, let's take this slow and we can definitely, just play it a little bit safer. But if they're like new to the tournament and there might be some nerfs, maybe they don't want to take the risk of taking it slower and then they do the more difficult pull anyway. You never know, right? We will see what the boys does because, again, they're not that far ahead, right?
I mean, sure, there's, one big mistake, a wipe on a low boss could definitely bring Paint for Femme back into this, but at this point, 8 deaths on the board as well as 24% trash behind, it would take a lot for the boys to throw this dungeon. They would pretty much have to wipe with Trothak or Harlan below 30%, I would have to say, for there to be any chance of a comeback. Because let's be honest, the mistakes that Paint for Femme made, they left mobs alive, their bolstering was bad, and just 8 deaths on the board, that's a lot to come back from.
Yeah, you are right. As we also see, Paint for Femme actually is playing the obelisk mob here. So probably indicating that they're not doing this kiting strat that we have seen by Perplex. I still need to talk to the teams because I really wonder why some of the teams are not opting to do this strategy, because watching it really doesn't seem as complex, right? It doesn't seem like there's lots of different things that go into this strategy, but maybe we are wrong. We're just the dumb casters. Maybe there's really a lot of strategy that goes into this and it's not as easy to just copy it. I'm not really sure.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like the boys is not going to be going for the strategy this time around. And to be honest, it could be something where it's actually more difficult than it looks and Zmok is just big-brained or their team is just big-brained. Because you have to think about it. The damage output is not that large. The tank, Warrior is pretty self-sustainable on only Harlan Suite. And the only probably dangerous part of the fight is when he gets into that last phase and the boss gains 100% attack speed. But of course, if you have all your defensive cooldowns available, it should be totally fine. The only other damage output is going to be those cannoneers, those little bombers that come out and fixate one of the players in your group. And if you have CC set up for that, which you do with the 200 traps as well as binding shots and maybe even freezing traps, you have so many ways to actually just not even have to worry about those. So it's definitely possible, and maybe they just don't have the CC rotation set up. You never know. I mean, maybe they're just not. Maybe they just don't want to pull it out here. I don't know. Maybe.
Either way, we see the boys are now done with their awakened mob. Now they're doing this Ravager pull. Now, the reason why this Ravager pull is not actually as easy as it looks is because those Ravagers, they cast a painful motivation, which is a dot that is being applied to themselves and to 2 other random mobs around them, and it does damage them. But if you pull all the packs together and you have 2 Ravagers on top of each other, the painful motivation might actually just go on the same mob twice, and another mob is not getting the dot at all. And because of this bolstering, that will be crucial. That will be a crucial mistake, because then that mob is high HP while all the other mobs are dead, and it's too highly bolstered, so you can't finish it off. So that's why they're pulling them apart, those 2 packs, to make sure that the painful motivation is going on all of them. Petco actually going down.
Ooh, unfortunate. They do have a battle res in the form of that engineering res, but you have to remember that engineering res is pretty dangerous to do, especially while the Blood of the Corruptor is live. If you get one of those purple puddles from the Blood of the Corruptor underneath you, you can die incredibly quickly in this setting. It's just something. So they're going to have to wait to res him until almost all of these awakened mobs are dead.
Yeah, and I mean, you can use the engineer and battle res in Turtle, but it looks like Demon Shai does not actually have Turtle ready to use that engineering res, and no cloak for Naladra either to just walk into the pool and get it out. Now, Petco did receive the res, so he's going to be back up. Shouldn't be as big of a drawback, but you still have those awakened mobs to deal with. So missing out on 1 damage dealer and 1 interrupt, well done that they still pull it off, at least until now.
Yeah, and you know what it is when it comes to these dungeons is making mistakes. Making mistakes is something that's almost always going to happen in an MDI key. Like you can go down the list of all of the keys we've had this weekend, and the amount of zero death keys that we've had are incredibly small. It's all about mitigating the mistakes you do make, and being able to have a DPS dead while you still have 3 awakened mobs alive, and come out of that with that being your only mistake is very impressive. I mean, the boys have just been impressive in general for this entire tournament. You know, I don't know exactly how good they are yet. We haven't seen them go against, you know, play incredibly well against the top end teams, but you know, we're going to see them play against if they keep playing the way they are, they're going to play against those top end teams pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, if they win this series, they're going to be matching up against Perplexed, and they have been very impressive as well. So definitely no easy task for the next couple of matches in this series here in this MDI. So we'll see as they probably win this matchup because the boss is on 50%. They still have 4% trash. We actually saw a team make a little bit of a mistake earlier where the rogue was pulling the pack and then didn't actually get the trash percentage. So there might still some small mistakes they can do for this, but at this point Pain for Femme is just too far behind. They didn't even engage the boss yet. They also have the 8 deaths, which is a 35-second timer in advantage for the boys. So this is really just the boys finishing off the dungeon probably and going 1-0, I assume.
Now we saw a mistake earlier today where someone went off and pulled some of those painful motivators and died as the mobs died, so they didn't actually get the mob count from it. So hopefully we'll see the boys not do that and deal with it the way it's properly supposed to be done. But as we've mentioned multiple times, Harlan Sweet, once he's below 30% HP, does gain a double damage taken debuff, so he's going to go down on short notice here, and we'll see them finish off the mob count like we just mentioned.
And at this point they might as well just play it safe. Instead of having the rogue solo the Ravager pack, they might as well just finish this boss off and then together move over, make sure everyone engages. The tank tanks it actually instead of having the rogue use the parry, just to be safe.
Yep, let's see. Don't mess it up, Naladra. All eyes are on you right now. We've got the wide view. Get down there. Yep, pull the priestess. Painful motivation cast. Let's go. Stay alive. There's not a lot that they have to do here. Painful motivation cast. Stay alive.
Did they interrupt?
You got it. Oh, no way. I think they actually did.
Maybe they did.
Oh, this is taking way too long. Come on. There we go.
There
Officer
it
died.
is.
Hey, there it is. The boys.
Naladra was so confident that he just didn't even put riposte up. He was like, no, I'm not going to die this time. Don't worry. Don't worry. The boys taking the game number 1 on Freehold as Pain for Femme was just not able to overcome a lot of the mistakes that they made early on there, Drenos.
Yeah, that was, starting with the second boss room, they lost quite a bit of time and they never were really able to recover from that. They had another wipe after that, and that was really all she wrote for Pain for Femme.
Yep, and the boys really showing just how much time, practice, experience that they have on Freehold at the moment, because even then, we're looking at the times, they were a little bit worse than their time trial on that one, Nagura, but they still played it very well, and they've had so much practice just in tournament play as well.
Yeah, it's just very impressive, to be honest. I'm going to say it again. The boys, so many very clean runs. They did have some small mistakes here and there in the other dungeons, and we saw one death in this dungeon as well. But all in all, they're just being very consistent. And for this kind of tournament to show the nurse to play this consistent is really impressive by them.
Right, because it is also just a long day of games for a lot of these guys coming through the lower bracket as well, and something, Tyrannical, you're very familiar with.
Don't remind me. That was a fun day. Yeah, sometimes you just gotta play a lot of World of Warcraft. I think that's something we're all familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Especially with Shadowlands coming around the corner,
oh, yeah.
You know? Time to practice all of the classes and prepare for everything. So, with the boys taking that game, it will also move us into game number 2. And we had talked about this previously, about how we're comparing time trials, and even how a lot of teams, Dranos, are realizing when they can actually pump the brakes at the very end of dungeons, play things a little bit more safely to make sure that they get through to the end.
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the dungeon, right? Some dungeons, there's an extra obelisk that's just sitting there by the last boss, and you can just activate that if you want to play a little bit safer, or you can go right into the boss. That gives you the option to call an audible at the last minute and make that change. A lot of other dungeons, though, there's not really an opportunity to change up your route that much without really changing the fundamentals of what you're doing. And in those cases, you're kind of locked into a strategy from the start and need to just do that as best as you can.
Yep. And at that point, it always comes to mind of what you do when you do make that mistake. I mean, when we're talking about, for example, Junkyard, we've seen a number of times as well as Ironic where teams having good knowledge of the dungeons, where those bots are, always come in handy.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this for a long time with Junkyard. We just want to see what a clean run looks like. Almost every single Junkyard run that we've seen this weekend has been, lots of wipes. Everyone has to re-get their bots, and these dungeons are probably taking 4 or 5 minutes longer than they have to. I want to see what a clean Junkyard looks like.
That's right. Before we see the clean Junkyard, let's see that clean performance there by the boys, and let's see those mistakes as well from Paint for Femme.
Yeah, so I don't want to spend too long talking about the mistakes, but what you can see is Paint for Femme, they tried this strategy of keeping Eudora friendly in combat with them, and that has some upsides. Eudora helps contribute to the fight, but it has some drawbacks where you are still in boss combat, so you can't just quickly release if you die, and that led them to having a quick wipe there that they maybe could have recovered from if they'd all been able to release to that graveyard. The boys, meanwhile, were executing their route. I wouldn't say perfectly, I wouldn't say it was their best ever Freehold, but it was pretty close. If they can always have it as clean as they did there, I think that they would be very happy with that. That's a good Freehold from them. They did have a death on the Harlan fight, but they were able to recover from that, and the death was actually there for quite a while, and they were able to keep things going, which is a sign of a team that is able to keep their composure, keep things calm when stuff starts to go wrong. That's a very good characteristic for an MDI team.
Without a doubt, and it's also very telling going from not having engineering battle reses last season, Nagura, into actually having them at the disposal.
Yeah, I'm actually glad that they enabled the engineering rest because it opens up more comps in my opinion. So because if you run a comp without a battle rest at all and you don't have an engineering rest, that's just, you can be confident in your performance, but just running without a single battle rest, it's just so risky. And that's why I really like having this engineering rest, opening up more compositions, not being required to run a Druid, DK, or a Warlock. Warlocks are not really being played anyway, but you know what I mean? So,
yeah.
So I really like having engineering rest.
Funny
Speaking
that you
of Warlocks.
mentioned that, because I'm over here holding my head in my hands because I can see what the players are locking in for this next round.
Oh, yeah,
We're in
because of
Siege of Boralus, and Shella is pulling out the Demonology Warlock. So instead of the typical 3 observers we have a 4th spectator in the dungeon.
That's right. Demonology Warlock is the spectator of the dungeon. They don't kick, they occasionally stun, they just do lots and lots of damage. But also, to pile on top of that, we are seeing the boys pulling out the Resto Druid, pulling out the Demon Hunter, pulling out the Rogue, the usual sort of composition, Ironic, that we do see from the boys on live servers.
Yeah, these guys have been great key pushers on live. I believe, was it last season that they were the #1 Raider IO team? These guys have been fantastic on live, and to see it just so easily transition over to the MDI is something that we've seen from teams like Method EU as well as some of the limit players. So there's a lot of overlap. It's a little bit different, but at the end of the day, it's a lot like just progression. You have to find your way through the dungeon, find the route that works, set up your cooldowns, and just practice.
That's right, and practice, as Paint for Femme is also going to be running as Horde throughout this Siege of Boralus that we have coming up next. While the boys are running with Alliance, what do you think is going to be the big advantage for a Horde side here, Dratnos?
Loktar of Gar, victory or death. I think the advantage is morale-based, being on the, the winning faction.
Battle Cry, Bloodlust.
Yeah, actually, this is the only time we've seen a Horde team so far in this MDI, and I think it will probably be the only time that we see Horde getting played. They have a different route that I think this team is more comfortable with, that is Horde-based, the starting as a Horde. And I think that we heard them say that they weren't super practiced in this dungeon when they time trialed with this composition. And so they're just sticking with what they play on live, and that includes the Horde side pathing. That does mean that they don't have to do the thing of killing Hadal first, because they don't have to wait for RP after Hadal dies. So they can continue to instead do a more of a straight line, less backtracking route. But they're going to get a little bit less count here at the start of the dungeon, because they don't have the faster path to the boss the way that the Alliance side does.
Yeah, that's true, and there's also going to be the difference for time trials as well, as Paint for Femme was 2 minutes slower than the boys during time trials, but as we know, they have more time to practice these time trial dungeons before the tournament. They know that they're going to be in there as well as Ironic, so I guess there's also that certain level of confidence once you know what your opponents are doing and how they play that dungeon, because they opted for bans in Junkyard and Underrot rather than Siege of Boralus.
Well, it's hard to get a faster time than another team when you're essentially formatting the dungeon, so I'm not really surprised that they were 2 minutes slow.
Tyrannical, don't you main Warlock?
I do. It's bad for dungeons. It's bad. I'm not even going to try to, skirt around it at all. It's not a good class for dungeons.
How do you really feel?
They do really good damage. That's about it.
At least you don't have a Mookin.
Yeah, you can actually look.
True.
Just look underneath Shelly's health bar. You can see everybody. Like the paladin has 10 different buttons we're tracking, and Shelly we just got 4 buttons we're tracking under there.
Yeah, and it even the funny thing is, it shows spell lock as one of the things he has, and he can't use that because you have your fell guard out and not a fell hunter. So you know what? I don't. Yeah, let's just see how it works out. You're gonna see purple on top of the damage meters a lot, but they're not gonna be doing a whole lot else.
I'm ready for that big Warlock damage as game number 2, as Paint for Femme is going to be fighting for their tournament lives, is ready and underway in the Siege of Boralus.
So yeah, I mean, the comps, right? Those interesting comps. Not only do we have the Warlock, but we also have a Vengeance Demon Hunter on the side of Paint for Femme. I do believe this is the first time we see a Vengeance Demon Hunter on the tournament play. They already played it in the time trial, so we already knew that they're going to play this, but still, it's going to be interesting to see what the Vengeance Demon Hunter can do. And then they also have a Holy Paladin, so very interesting comp by Paint for Femme. And the boys, of course, running their comfort comp with the Rasta Druid and the Demon Hunter.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around why this is the thing that they chose to go for. Like, let's be honest. Shelly is known for playing Warlock. It's his main character, as well as mine. It does a massive amount of damage. It has cooldowns available for just about every pack. Your Demonic Tyrant is about a little over a 1 minute cooldown. But outside of that, what's he going to do? He's going to single target stun every 45 seconds. He's going to Shadow Fury every minute. There's not really a whole lot you can do outside of that. And he popped his Demonic Tyrant here with his Trinket, with his Berserking, and he's still doing less damage than the Hunter. Unless this is a dungeon where you... Oh, okay. Stop talking about the Warlock. The boys are wiping over here to the first boss. Maybe we'll see a Warlock win. Never mind. I'm excited now.
Yeah, okay, so I unfortunately was also looking at the Warlock right now because I was so excited, so I didn't see what really happened for the boys, but I assume it was a combination of bursting with other abilities happening from the boss here, causing them to wipe. And it was Gigabob that went down first, so they didn't have a battle rest. I mean, yeah, they could have used the engineering rest, but it takes so long. And then it just all collapsed, unfortunately for them. This is a huge time loss because they committed Bloodlust and a bunch of offensive cooldowns to do this pull. So huge time loss for them. As Pain for Femme, they executed the trash pull plus boss perfectly. Now it's only the boss left, which really should not be a big deal for them to finish off.
Yeah, I mean, this is, for a team like the boys who's been so consistent throughout this entire bracket, to see them have a mistake at the start of the dungeon like that, it's kind of surprising to see. But to be honest, we saw Perplexed have almost that exact same issue. Well, an issue in the same section of the dungeon. It's a similar philosophy to what I was talking about earlier. These dungeons are 18-minute long boss encounters where you have to make sure that you're on point with everything that you're doing the entire time. And sometimes your mind slips. Sometimes you forget an interrupt. Sometimes you forget how to do a mechanic properly because you don't really think about it after doing it so many times. And a mistake happens and you wipe. That's just kind of the name of the game right now. And these teams have to have incredibly high mental fortitude in order to make sure that they get through the entire dungeon cleanly. And they have to do it throughout the course of a tournament for 10 to 15 dungeons. It's a lot to do.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, mistakes happen to every single team. Even the very best, Method EU, we definitely see them make mistakes as well. Like earlier when mobs just stand in the Sanguine and they're not being pulled out properly. Sometimes a mistake happens and it causes you to cost a minute or two. And sometimes you have a mistake that can be only 5 seconds lost, right? So it really depends what kind of mistake you make when it happens. And unfortunately for the boys, this mistake was a big one. And it cost them a lot of time. Now, Pain for Femme on the other side, they managed to finish off the first boss, and they're moving on to do some trash here. Now, I want to mention one thing about their comp, because I did talk to them about their time trials, and they said that they picked the wrong comp for this dungeon. They were aware that they picked the wrong comp after the time trial was over, but I assume they just didn't want to invest any more time changing up their comp here for the tournament, because there's already so many other dungeons they have to practice that switching up your composition for a dungeon you've already practiced with a different one might just not be the most efficient time investment. So that's why they're sticking to this comp, I think.
Well, the scary thing about that is that, your tournament life is on the line right now for this comp that you chose. It's not something that you really want to have in your back pocket. They knew coming into this series that they'd have to play that Warlock comp in this dungeon if they chose not to ban it, and, here they are. And I'm worrying that just because they have that super suboptimal comp, maybe even with that early wipe, you know, they could actually come back in this dungeon if they play cleanly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in the end, you really gotta think about the boys also not running the best comp either. I mean, I wouldn't say it's as bad as Paint for Fem's comp, right? Because they're not running as different of a comp as most other teams, but they still have the Raster Druid, which is suboptimal compared to the Mistweaver that we have seen, because you're missing out on the physical damage buff, on top of also missing out on the Way of the Crane to do those big pulls or to enable those big pulls. And then Rogue is probably... You know, we've seen different combinations of DPS that worked, but the boys still just also playing their comfort picks, to be honest. So in the end, I do still think that their comp is better compared to Paint for Femme, but also not the most optimal one.
I'm sorry, I was just laughing at that insane Warlock utility with the Demonic Gateway over that tiny little river that you can just jump across. That's absolutely nuts. Man, you Warlocks are a lock-in for this dungeon.
You're such a hater.
You know, okay, you know, when Warlock was meta in an insane class to bring to Mythic Plus and Legion, it made sense, right? But I feel like there's no reason to play something like this if you have, you know, Shelly's a great rogue player. He's a great DK player. I'm sure they could have found, he plays Demon Hunter as one of his mains on live. You know, it doesn't really make sense to try to pigeonhole yourself into Warlock for this dungeon. Now, the one thing that Warlock is incredibly good for in this dungeon is the final boss, but gotta hold on that for a second because we got some more deaths on the board for the boys. 2 deaths on the board while they're dealing with this spotter and the trash around him on that left side of your screen. Fortunately, not a full team wipe, but you know, extra deaths on the board when you're already behind is not helping you out at all.
Yeah, they died to the bursting stacks here, unfortunately, on the boys' side. Now, probably also, again, an issue maybe with the Raster Druid. I mean, the Raster Druid can heal a lot of bursting stacks, but you know, you have Tranquility to heal it, and outside of that, you really don't have as much as a Raster Druid because you just don't have that kind of AoE burst healing that some of the other healers provide. So, Raster Druid not being the best healer to heal really, really high bursting stacks. Petka going down, and Gigabop also dropping very low because of bursting again.
All right, so there's something I want to go over on this particular boss, and it's one of the little quirks that Demonology Warlock has. And yes, I'm a Warlock main. Yes, I'm going to talk about Warlocks when there's one in the MDI because you really never see them. They're kind of an anomaly. Warlock's main cooldown, Demonic Tyrant, is a demon that you summon, and we use a talent that makes it more powerful based off of the amounts of imps you have alive. Now, of course, over time, your imps use their energy, and the Demonic Tyrant's damage is based off of the amount of imp energy you have. So the longer your imps are alive, the worse it gets. Something that you can do as a Warlock is you can stand out of line of sight of your target, so your imps won't be able to cast right away. So they have to run around whatever, you know, is in between you and the target in order to actually get to the target and start casting. So you saw Shelly Tyven, he was actually standing way out of line of sight of the boss, summoning a bunch of imps, and his imps were all at full energy. You can see him shooting up the damage meters in single target right now with that massively buffed Tyrant. Almost all of that damage he's doing is priority single target boss damage. He is absolutely annihilating the boss right now. Just one of the little quirks of Demonology. It's kind of fun to look at,
that was
but
close, though.
Not really a whole lot. It was kind of close to phasing.
Yeah, it's almost in full energy there, and Dread Captain Lockwood always jumps away on full energy bar. And if you get one extra phase because you don't get her down fast enough, that's a big damage loss because she jumps away and she can't actually be killed when she's away. So even if you have dots or bleed effects on the boss, she won't actually go down once she did jump away. So very well done by Paint for Femme to finish her off before she did that intermission phase again. As they move on, now we see the boys also engaging Dread Captain Lockwood. So it doesn't actually seem like they're that far behind time-wise in the dungeon, but they have the 8 deaths, right? Which is a 40 seconds difference on top of also just being straight up behind in the dungeon as well. Now, Paint for Femme having a very clean run so far. I mean, you gotta give it to them, and I jinxed them as Nemo
You jinxed him!
My bad.
Dread Captain Lockwood was incredibly high on the side of the boys there. 82% coming into this phase. They're going to have to, you know, pick up the single target damage a lot here if they want to have any chance of one phasing this. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to do it at all. I mean, this boss is incredibly high. They're going to get an entirely extra intermission phase, and that's going to set them even further behind on top of the death timers they have.
Yeah, so...
Bad.
Yeah, I mean... We talked about the boys being so consistent and now having those 8 deaths here and just not performing that well in this dungeon, which, again, it's a time trial dungeon, and usually they should be performing the best in the time trial dungeons because those are the dungeons they practice the most out of all of them, right? Because you've already practiced for time trials and then you practice again for the tournament. Now, sometimes maybe teams choose to not practice the time trial dungeons as much anymore because they have to practice all the other tournament dungeons. Maybe that's the reason why some of the teams are being inconsistent with those time trial ones, because we've also seen teams do really badly in junkyards. That was also a time trial map, and we've also seen teams choke and have so many mistakes there. So maybe that's maybe they just focus too much on all the other dungeons, thinking that they don't have to re-practice the time trial ones, and maybe it costs them.
Yeah, that's definitely true. You know, it's something that we've talked about previously as well. You know, maybe they think that they're good, they have good enough practice already, and it looks like it could be costing them here. It's just kind of weird because, surprisingly enough, even though they died so many times and they've been behind, they're essentially at the same point in the dungeon here. I think that Paint for Fem has way more trash percentage than they technically should have at this point. Usually they have this 59% trash percentage. This is what Method EU and Perplexed had after they killed Haddle and cleared his entire room out. So you kind of have to wonder, you know, what are they doing right now? This is definitely an inferior strategy that we're seeing from Paint for Fem.
Yeah, I agree. This probably means that they will not go back and do some of those spotter things that we've been seeing other teams do. But abusing the spotter and actually getting rid of all the trash with the spotter just seems so much more efficient than having to deal with it without the extra spotter damage, especially because it is a raging environment. So you can just get the spotter to raging, making sure that the friendly fire does even more damage to the trash, and it's just so much more efficient. And not abusing that seems bad. So we'll see what they do later on, as the boys are already moving on to Haddal, making use of the boss actually pulling you out of that other realm here. So a very good strategy by the boys.
Yeah, they ended up using the typical Warlock gateway that you saw, skipping almost half of this whole Buccaneer area. That's something that I didn't quite think about. Obviously, they are high in trash percentage now, but this should be about all they need at this point. You know, they get the same final trash pack that we saw Method EU and Perplexed both pull into this raging spotter. They have to make sure they get into that raging section first. It's not quite there yet, so gotta remember, in this raging affix, when the mob gets below 30% HP, it does double damage, and that includes the spotted artillery friendly fire that you get from the spotter. So this trash pack is going to go incredibly easy to the next side of the artillery, but it's kind of dangerous right now. Everything is raging at the same time. It needs to die quickly to this next set of artillery.
Yeah, you see the strength of the Vengeance Demon Hunter here. When he's got this meta up, then he's basically just immune to dying, really. So that's why you can see him just tanking all of these raging mobs on this Vengeance Demon Hunter, while maybe other tanks would need to start kiting or use some sort of utility to get the mobs away. But no problem for the Vengeance Demon Hunter, tanking all of these raging mobs at the same time. Also, Vengeance doing quite a bit of AoE damage as well, of course, compared to maybe some other tanks. Now, in the end, Prot Warrior is still going to be the one tank that does the most damage out of all of the tanks, but Vengeance Demon Hunter not too far behind in that regard.
Yeah, and of course we're seeing another inefficiency of the strat coming here from Paint for Fem. They are pulling all of the trash back instead of pulling it with the boss, but they do have the spotter available, so this is why they're doing it this way. But the boys have had Petco go down, and then on top of that, their tank and Demon Shia have also go down. They do have the battle res in the form of that Resto Druid, but this boss is still at 35% HP. They're gonna have to single target DPS down with one rogue. Not to mention, they still have multiple Raging Commanders alive, and there's just no way they're gonna be able to finish this off. That's gonna be another full team wipe for the boys.
This is such a big mistake again by the boys, having to just have a full team wipe, the boss resetting. This is gonna cost them so much time again, on top of course, also having the death difference here. 13 death difference is a huge amount of time lost from the deaths alone. Even though I do think that this strategy, as you mentioned, is slightly superior because they're making so much use of the spotter compared to the Paint for Fem strategy here. But if you make those kind of mistakes, you just can't afford it, as Rats goes down again, trying to make his way back to the boss room.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a lot of things going wrong at the same time. It's not what you like to see in the slightest, and they still have multiple commanders alive. Now, of course, everyone is still in this realm. They're waiting for their tank to come back and pull the boss, which will yank them out of the realm at this point. That's really all they can hope for. It's not looking great, and Rads has gone down again, so I think that's all she wrote for the boys, where it's just kind of a victory lap now for Paint for Fem. They have to get through these final two bosses on Fortified, and it'll be a 1-1 series afterwards, it looks like.
Yeah, interesting to see that they are struggling so much in this dungeon here, specifically when we have been talking about the consistency. Well, what's the next game they're playing? What's the third match? I think it's MOTHERLOAD, if I'm not...
It looks like it's going to be a MOTHERLOAD, yeah, so that's definitely something we have to look forward to. Now, to be honest, it's not completely done yet, right?
Yeah, theoretically there's still a chance, right? Yeah.
Right, yeah. If Pain for Fem happens to wipe at Haddle at 30%, or they have a problem with the Awakened Mob, especially if they wipe on the last boss and they have to refight the Awakened Mobs without Lust all over again, you know, the boys could still come back on this dungeon. It's definitely a possibility. But just look, you know, reading the field right now with a 15 death advantage, and the fact that the boys still has to go back after dealing with Haddle and go deal with the rest of the trash, it doesn't look good for them. And on top of that, now Shia has gone down again, and they do not have a battle res for him, so it's going to just take them even longer to finish off Haddle here.
Yeah, just too many problems for them here in this specific pull that they were doing with Dark Fathom. Now, it is a very dangerous pull, of course, because you're pulling the boss and the whole room with it. So there's so many things that are going on at the same time. You have bursting when the mobs die, you have them raging once they reach less than 30% HP, you have the commanders charge around, so if you stand in a charge you get stunned, you have the poison being applied to the tank. There's just so many things happening at the same time, so this is definitely a very, very dangerous pull, and so many things can go wrong here, as we can see it happen for the boys, as Pain for Femme is now very close to finishing off Haddal, and they only need 2% more trash, which they will get with the Awakened mobs that they're playing with the last boss. Now, this can still cause some problems having to deal with the Awakened mobs here, as we've seen some other teams already struggle with this as well.
Yeah, now something else that Demonology has in its back pocket is if they pull this boss instantly, he'll still have those imps available from the final boss, and he'll be able to instantly Tyrant this first Gripping Terror, which will help them kill the first Gripping Terror incredibly quickly. If he is able to do that, you'll see a lot of damage. The Tyrant just came from him there as well, so yeah, you'll see a lot of burst damage out of the Demonology Warlock here, and it's pure single target on the Gripping Terror. But after that Tyrant is gone, there's not really a whole lot left of his damage for these Awakened mobs, and it's going to be just the Hunter and the Rogue dealing with them. Fem dropping low to those Awakened mobs,
wow.
But he's a Demon Hunter, he'll be fine.
Yeah, he actually just took the Tank Buster's debuff here. You can see the Spirit Breaker debuff on Fem, but he's fine now. Now, the last boss with the Awakened mob is actually very difficult, especially because of the Tank Buster's Dark Fury, as you saw the AoE happening here, because of the Demolisher Tentacles. Now, they need to be tanked by the aggro target, and if you're not close enough, they will start casting an AoE on the whole group, and that will be dangerous. And that's why the tank has to stand in Dark Fury, taking a lot of damage, so that the Demolisher Tentacle doesn't actually cast the AoE. Now, the voice actually just had a full wipe again on very low HP, I just saw.
At like 2% on the boss,
no.
and the Ladra was trying the heroics at the end, but it just wasn't enough. Unfortunate for them.
Well, either way,
Man.
Pain for Femme is dealing with the last boss still. I mean, the boys, I think at this point, they just have to, I mean, forget about this dungeon, just put their head into the next game and move on, really. Like, if this dungeon stays on their mind and they start maybe, like, blaming themselves or blaming someone else for certain mistakes, that will not do them any good at all. So they definitely want to just make sure they forget about this siege, forget that it ever happened, really, and just move on to the next dungeon, which I believe is the MOTHERLOAD, because at this point, there's no way they're gonna come back, because Pain for Femme, all they have left to do is finish off this last boss. They finished their Awakened mobs as well, so it really should not be any sort of problem anymore for Pain for Femme to finish it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they can play it super safe and make sure that they have all their cooldowns available for this final platform. They don't even have to shoot the cannon right away. They can just sit here and rest on their laurels and wait for all of the cooldowns to come off cooldown. No Demonic Tyrant for the last platform means that the Warlock is going to be a complete burden. Not like it hasn't been for the rest of the dungeon on this final platform, and they're not going to be able to do that much damage to the Gripping Terror. It's going to be pretty much just the Hunter and the Rogue dealing with this final Gripping Terror here.
And, I mean, we talked about the voice mistakes throughout this whole dungeon, really, but Pain for Femme, outside of their comp maybe not being the most optimal for this dungeon, I mean, you gotta give it to them that they have been playing really clean, right? They have one death on the board only, so they have done a really clean run so far. I mean, of course, their time might just not be the best time compared to some of the other teams, but they play consistently, and they did not have any of those huge mistakes, so you still gotta give it to Pain for Femme for at least playing it cleanly.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, the one death with a Warlock in this dungeon, you have to look at what having a Warlock over another class. They don't have an interrupt. They don't have that much of a utility. You know, it's impressive that they're able to get through the dungeon clean with only one death. And if I'm not mistaken, that was almost, that was faster than their time trial time
It
by
was
about 20
faster.
seconds.
Faster,
So yeah, I
yeah.
mean, they're playing pretty well. I just, I don't hate Warlock, but it's just not a good pick. I don't know why you'd pigeonhole yourself like that.
Understandable, and the skepticism also is coming from the perspective that the boys had about a 2-minute faster time trial run than Pain for Femme, but it was just mistakes galore throughout that game that Dratnos just was not really possible for them to come back, and it just seemed like the tilt overwhelmed them later on.
Yeah, Siege of Boralus is kind of this dungeon. There's a lot of difficult pulls, and things can start to go wrong very easily, especially that Hadal Dark Fathom room. A lot of teams have made it look easy, but it is by no means easy. That room is a very easy one to wipe in rather than actually succeed in. So I'm not surprised to see those pulls not working out. In fact, I'm surprised to have seen so many teams execute them so cleanly so far. I was expecting to see more, mishaps and having to kind of wing it in that later half of the dungeon in Siege.
Without a doubt, but I think there's also a pretty big advantage being able to have this as their time trial dungeon, and in many cases knowing Nagura before they go to broadcast that this is one of those dungeons they're going to play, and they're going to play a lot.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, you just gotta think about the mentality as well, especially when you've been practicing the time trial dungeon so much, and it's a very you're so time restricted for practicing for the tournament because they've only been told the affixes, I believe, 1 day before the actual tournament starts. So they only have a little bit more than 24 hours, I believe, to actually practice all of those dungeons. And then I think a lot of teams are just going to be maybe neglecting the time trial dungeons a little bit because they've already practiced those for the time trials, right? So even if they think they might have a suboptimal comp or a suboptimal strategy compared to some of the other teams, there's just not enough time to re-practice something that you've already done when there's so many other dungeons that you haven't practiced at all, right? So I think it's alright that we see some of those teams struggle a little bit with those time trial dungeons, but maybe they have to change up their strategy next time around to really just re-practice the time trials before they go to the actual tournament, so we don't have this happen anymore.
I think that's always one of the big challenges as well, though, is, yes, you'll be able to start seeing in that same tournament weekend how everybody else plays, but in many other cases, Dranos, you kind of aren't quite able to make adjustments for next week because the affixes will just end up changing. And we really saw it as we go through some of the replays here about just sticking to your own strategy.
Yeah, so my replays, I'm going to focus on some positive things. They call me Dratnos, friend to Warlocks, unlike Xyronic.
Wait, what did you rank them in Horrific Visions?
Oh, pull out the tier list!
We've got some, we got some cool gateway skips in the start of the dungeon. Nothing too major, but some time saved, skipping over some water. Some cool stuff actually from the Vengeance Demon Hunter as well. While fighting, the second boss even, they had a good Sigil of Chains. But what was really cool with the Vengeance Demon Hunter was Sigil of Silence into grouping a bunch of enemies, into Sigil of Chainsing them, into some spotter AoE. Then they went into an obelisk, and they set up a gateway, and they did this gateway into Shroud, into Sigil of Misery, destroying a bunch of enemies with a spotter. That is something that really is making use of the best of their composition. That gateway, especially across that little piece of terrain, is something that you can only really do if you have a Warlock in your group. And then after that, they did this similar thing where they combined their Vengeance Demon Hunter and their Beast Mastery Hunter, where they used Binding Shot to funnel a bunch of enemies into one spot, and then they Sigil Misery'd him and hit him with the spotter again there. So really a lot of cool combinations of the Warlock's Gateway plus the Rogue Shroud, the Vengeance Demon Hunter's Sigil plus the Hunter's Binding Shot. Those sorts of combos, really cool to see working together in that group comp. And I think that's why they picked it, is because they were all so familiar with using those sorts of combos. And if you change any one of those things to a more meta spec, you lose all the combos that you get as a part of it.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Thank you so much, Dranos, friend to Warlocks. Now, Xyronic, enemy of Warlocks. Are you gonna repent your ways?
Absolutely not. They don't call me the betrayer for nothing. I mean, here's the thing, right? I made a Warlock on live. I don't hate Warlocks. It's just, it's a suboptimal pick. That's all there is to it. That's, you can see we're swapping to this dungeon right now and Shelly instantly back on the DK. Hey, that's fine.
Now Xyronic will be 20% nicer, more wholesome onto this one, right?
No.
Whoa, okay. All right, never mind. Meanie who hurts people's feelings.
That's
okay.
me.
I believe we're going into Motherload, if I'm not mistaken, on this next one, right? Yep.
Yeah.
We got Motherload, we've got a bunch of Unholy DKs picked and selected. We've seen a couple teams jump from double Unholy DK to just one at times as well, Nagura. What are you making of going with that Hunter pick versus going with the second Unholy?
I'm not really sure. I think it depends on how you're pulling the dungeon as well. There's pros and cons to everything. Now, one thing that speaks for the Hunter, in my opinion, is the different kinds of HP pools that you have in Motherload. Because in some other dungeons like Freehold, where everything has the same amount of HP, you just bring the DK, you burst all of them down at the same time, and you win the game, right? But in Motherload, you have Peacekeepers, which have a lot more HP than everything else. And the pools really only end when the Peacekeepers die. And Peacekeeper single target damage might just be stronger for the Hunter overall, because they just have more consistent cooldowns available, they have more consistent single target damage compared to a DK. So maybe for the Peacekeeper part earlier, the Hunter might just be better than a DK.
Interesting. I also really like having the Hunter for Binding Shot, and we've seen some areas where it's really helpful at being able to have the misdirect as well. So a number of those pulls, in fact, Radnos, we've had warriors just leaping out at the very last second, Binding Shot goes down, or all the slows they can get go down, just to be able to give that warrior enough breathing room to drop their Necrotic before it gets too late.
Yeah, and with two Unholy Death Knights, Skittish can be a real problem here. Both of them, generating huge amounts of threat, and the tank has to worry about kiting with Necrotic as well. So it's going to be a real challenge, but I think there is a lot of potential there for them to pull off something really exciting with those two Death Knights, if they can handle those affix as well.
Yeah, that's true, and that's one thing we're always kind of following is we've had a couple different times where there have been deaths just because of threat being drawn by Unholy DKs, and it's just at the point right now where Unholy DK is so ridiculously powerful that a lot of times you're just not going to be able to pull threat off of them if they get their damage set up, if they get everything together that they really need. As we're getting our last bit of ready checks going, also keep in mind that this game is going to be the decider, as the boys and Paint for Femme are both 1-1 right now, with the Motherload determining who is going to be moving on to face up against Perplex, who is now sitting in the lower finals awaiting them. So when it comes down to this, I think it's best to talk about it, Nagura. How does the boys shake off that tilt after that disappointing loss in Siege?
I mean, I'm not really sure how much this is going to affect them, because they are live server players, and we all know that keys get depleted a lot on live servers, especially if you're trying to push high keys. It's very easy to deplete a key now and then, so I think that they are used to this, and that something can just go wrong in a dungeon, and I think they should be able to just shake it off and focus on this Motherload here.
Alright, we'll see if they're going to be able to do it, as the score is now tied, as the boys and Paint for Femme seal the deal and find out who is getting eliminated in the Motherload.
So, straight away, we already see this difference in comp here, where we see the double DK come in from Paint for Femme, no more Warlocks, and we see the 1 DK Hunter come by the boys.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see a lot of giant pulls here, and actually having that double DK available to you is going to let them do even bigger pulls even more quickly. This is something we've seen a lot from the boys where, even in the Underrot, they have Petco on the Hunter, even though it might not necessarily be the best comp once again. But of course, as we've seen from the last dungeon, not running the best comp doesn't tend to matter if the other team makes mistakes. So really what it's going to come down to is, which team can be more clean with their pulls here. And so far, we're seeing a really weird routing already from Paint for Femme. They decided to pull the first obelisk into this middle room instead of just shouting through. Kind of weird from them.
Yeah, interesting to see that they are not skipping this mob. We've already seen another team not skip this, as far as I'm aware. But the boys choosing to do this insane pull at the very start. We already saw them play Motherload once. They only had 3 deaths in that run, so it was a pretty clean run. The only thing that was a pretty big mistake by them was losing 1 player in the last boss, so they had to 4-man the last boss. But outside of that, it was a really clean run, so I assume they have again a clean run with this 42% trash pull they do at the start. It's just an insane amount of trash they're getting off of this first pull with their Bloodlust.
Yeah, and already at 42% trash, like you mentioned, and they're probably just going to look to pull it straight into the boss with this DK here and get some cleave off. And I mean, like we mentioned, it's going to come down to who gets that better execution. And the boys, I think they kind of spent all of their all of their mistakes in that last dungeon. 26 deaths in the course of one dungeon. They were just kind of beating their heads into the wall. Maybe while they were beating their heads into the wall in Haddle, they weren't really focused on doing the dungeon. They were just kind of going through the motions of playing the game and going over their strategy for the next dungeon because they kind of knew they'd always lost. It's something we typically see from a lot of other games, esports as well.
Yeah, and Pain for Fun didn't actually commit their Bloodlust yet, so I assume they're gonna gather up for a big pull now. There we go. Okay, so now they're committing their Bloodlust, doing a pretty big pull here as they have a lot of bugs and some Peacekeepers coming in very soon as well. Now, one thing that's a little bit annoying for the DKs here is that the Peacekeepers come in later and they kind of want to hold their damage a little bit because you want to do damage on the Peacekeepers as well and not just the thugs and everything else. So you gotta hold your damage a little bit. As you can see now, the damage from Shelly coming out and everything just dropping very, very low.
Yeah, but again, the efficiency of the pulls that Pain for Fem is doing here is definitely lower than what we saw from the boys. The boys definitely got almost all of their trash percentage before the boss in that one pull, and then instantly went into the second boss. We're gonna have to see something similar on the side of Pain for Fem, otherwise they're just gonna have a hard time catching up in this dungeon.
Yeah, most definitely. Like, this 42% trash pull that they do at the start, that's just a crazy pull. 42%, that's such a big amount for Motherload specifically, because Motherload is such a trash-heavy dungeon. The amount of trash you have to kill for the 42 is just insane, and the fact that they pull it off so almost easily, it looks very easy when they do it, is very, very impressive. And now they also pulled the trash pack on top of coin-operated Crowd Pummeler, and it also looked very easy, even though it really isn't. We've seen other teams struggle with this exact same pull, because you have Necrotic and you have Skittish as well, while the tank needs to take care of a Tyrannical boss at the same time.
Yeah, and the important thing to mention about the comp that the boys has here with that one DK and that one Hunter is they have a lot more of a, how should I say, balanced comp. If they need single target, ooh, that was a little spooky there. Missed bomb kick from Petco there, and the entire group took a little bit of damage, but it looks like they're going to be okay off the back of that one. But yeah, having the Hunter gives them a little bit of extra access to that single target damage, and like we're going to see on the next boss, any fixates that go on the Hunter, they can just infinitely kite, so that'll help them out. But we're seeing them gear up for this massive pull here.
This is a very scary pull because all of these mobs do so much tank damage, and also Necrotic on the tanks. You can see that Dwarf Ratio being used by Reds here, and you see how low everything drops because of the DK damage. What a nicely executed pull. This is a pull that can definitely instantly wipe your whole group if the tank goes down or the tank needs to start kiting. It's so easy for the damage dealers to die from a rock throw or just getting aggro because of Skittish.
Yeah, and I mean, that was impressive right there. It's a Tyrannical dungeon, right? So the trash has less health. So if you can do all the AoE damage that you need with one DK, hey, just run one DK. Why not? Easy enough. We are going to see a planned death here going down on Rads. Everyone else is going to pop their Shadow Meld, which of course Rads doesn't have because he's a dwarf. And they're going to get a quick res on him and move right into this second boss here. Everything that just happened was planned. So one death on the board because of that. But we're going to see, once again, any fixates that go on the Hunter here. Unfortunately, only one fixate on the Hunter. So Shai's going to have to deal with those. But yeah, he's going to be able to just kite in circles and not lose any damage because of it.
Yeah, not the best RNG on the fixates here, unfortunately not on Petco as you mentioned, but they can probably just off-tank some of those debuffs and Bob is going to be able to out-heal them. You see Chaya having 2 fixates and Bob having 2 as well. A little bit unfortunate, but they should be fine. They are not pulling any trash on top here, as we've seen some other teams do. They pulled the mini-boss, which is the trash group right in front of Azeroth on top, something that the boys are not doing, or they're doing it later on in the fight. Pain for Fem just now engaged coin-operated Crowd Pummeler, and I mean, they're a little bit ahead in trash percentage. They're on 73% compared to 65%, but it's still a whole boss fight behind, so Pain for Fem definitely has a lot of catching up to do if they want to have any chance against the boys here.
I mean, in terms of just raw travel time and progression in the dungeon, the boys are massively ahead here. It's really not even close. Yeah, Pain for Fem has dealt with that one obelisk earlier on in the dungeon, but the boys are planning on pulling that with the final boss anyways, so it's not really that big of an advantage unless they choose to have to do more obelisks later on because of it. So just looking at the overall state of the dungeon right now, there's a lot of catching up to do for Pain for Fem, and they have some pretty gnarly pulls that they have to do afterwards as well.
Yeah, definitely, because I mean, we've seen some of the teams actually do these Stone Fury pulls, which is something the boys did not do. So I wonder what kind of percentage the boys is going to get, because 35% is quite a bit they still have to do. So I wonder if they do some pulls in this RMP area that MDI they will see right after this boss, or if they get the last percentage in between the next boss and the last boss. Either way, gonna be interested to see what kind of pulls they're doing.
They could always go back and pull the mini boss. They just decided not to choose it, pull it with the boss. But based off the direction they're running, they're not going to do that, and they're going to be getting a lot of their percentage rate, like you mentioned, in the research and development section of the dungeon. Now, we did see from one of our previous mother loads that one of the things that teams tend to do is to run around this entire first house and literally pull all of the rat packs to allow the demon DK to really pop off with their damage, and it looks like we're actually seeing that as well. Tricks of the Trade coming out from Naladra, everything getting fixated in on rads, and yeah, we're gonna see that DK do some crazy damage here.
That's a pretty scary pull, especially in this era here, because there's a lot of very scary mobs that do some scary mechanics that you don't want to deal with. But if you just out DPS everything before anything happens, you don't have to deal with it. As we can see, Demon Shire here on the DK doing almost 1 million DPS, just nuking everything down. They are now 82% because of this trash pull, so they got a lot of percentage there. This seems like a very, very efficient strategy, to be honest. They're playing so well around the DK's cooldowns. It's very impressive how they do those big pulls whenever the cooldowns are ready, and then they deal with bosses in between. So very well done by the boys so far, as they do one of their Awakened mobs now.
And if Pain for Finn wants to have any chance of coming back to this dungeon, they need to make this pull worth it. They went for an even bigger pull after the coin-operated crowd pummeler. They even got some of those one of those extractors in with them as well, and it looks like they're going to be pulling this obelisk to the second boss. That's the only reason I could think of them even going back there and pulling those, but no problem for them. Ricky popping off with 1 million DPS and Shelly right behind with 650k, just both taking from the same piece of the pie there, and no issues from them whatsoever. But the funny thing is, their DPS added together is about what Shaya ended up doing on that exact same pull, just as 1 DK. So normally I'm an advocate for a double DK comp, but it looks like the 1 DK is a little bit more efficient here.
Yeah, and I'm very surprised that they're also killing this Awakened mob, because they've already dealt with the first one. So if they deal with this Awakened mob as well, it seems very inefficient to pull the next two with the last boss, because those are very useful to do those skips that we've been seeing by the boys. Unless they want to kill all of the Awakened mobs actually before going to the last boss, which also seems very inefficient. So we'll see what they do later on. Very interesting strat coming out from them, while the boys are already fighting Rixa Flaxflame with some of the War Machine trash that is after the boss.
Yep, and we're seeing this, like you mentioned, this typical strategy of bringing in 2 extra trash mobs for a little extra trash count, but that's not going to get them anywhere near the percentage they need. I believe with the 3 Awakened mobs, they still need to get another about 8 to 10% trash in order over the course of the dungeon, not including this War Machine here, of course. So they still have something left to pull. I don't know if just the mobs that are next to this final obelisk are enough for them, but we'll have to see. I imagine that's going to be what they end up pulling for the rest of their trash count.
Yeah, maybe. And now that I'm thinking about it, maybe because Pain for Femme, they are 95% trash at this point. So there's so little trash left for them to do. Maybe they pull the War Machine on top of Rixa, and maybe they actually use the Realm from the next Awakened mob to just move to the last boss, and then have the Rogue maybe stealth all the way through, engage the last boss, which then is going to pull them out of Realm, and they're going to use that to skip the last trash packs, I assume. Either way, still very far behind, even if the idea of the strategy seems like a good idea, but the way they execute it is just so much slower compared to the boys, because both of them are on very low deaths, 1 death versus 0 deaths, and it's still an insane amount of time in between them. So just the strategy so much better from the boys.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the general progression of the Motherload that we saw in the MDI last year, we saw a very, very stark change in how teams pulled this dungeon from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. The strategies that we saw at the beginning of the year saw some of the teams pulling something like 80% of the trash before we even got to the coin-operated crowd pummeler, just because of the amount of peacekeepers you pull, and it was generally thought at that point that was the most efficient thing to do. But as you went throughout the year, people realized that you could put together bigger and bigger pulls right after the pummeler, and you could get more efficient trash that way. And then you could also start pulling trash into the second boss. So they kind of went away from pulling more of the trash at the start of the instance. In looking at the way both of these teams have pulled, the boys have sort of exhibited a strategy more similar to what the team started doing at the end of the year, whereas Pain for Femme kind of ended up going for one of those more earlier on strats that got more trash before the first boss, and it's just kind of looked slower for them.
Yeah, I agree. I like the strategy where you just pull more trash later on, because it just always involved a lot of backtracking when you do most of your trash at the start area, and on top of that, if you get all of your trash percentage done early on, then later on you're just running in between bosses. And if you're just running, not killing anything, it's just straight up time loss. Straight up time where you just run, do nothing else. And when you go from boss to boss, you're also missing out on cooldown usages in between, and you have to do a bunch of trash without cooldowns at the very start. So I think I like the fact that you just pull more trash later on, as we see the boys doing here. Now they only have to deal with this last Sky Screecher here as they go into the last Awakened mob. They are 99%, so once they kill the Awakened mobs with the last boss, they are going to be 100%, and then there's only the last boss left.
Yeah, and this looks like it's just a safety strategy as well. It almost looked like Petco was planning on running up without pulling that Sky Scorcher. Maybe that was due to some sort of, I don't know, maybe some sort of like a snapbacker. Like if you pulled that, you would have pulled the other two mobs that were close to it as well. I'm not 100% sure. But just interesting strategy from them. They're going to take it easy, pull this Fear Awakened mob, the Beckoner of Chaos, up to the boss. And like you mentioned, they only have the final boss with those Awakened mobs left. And I believe they've only pulled 2, so they'll have to deal with 2 on this final boss. But the most difficult ones are definitely out. The Fear Mob is out, the Blood of the Corruptor is out, so they only have to deal with the Interrupt guy and the Tank Buster, both of which they have plenty of ways to deal with. So I don't envision them having too much trouble with this particular final boss pull.
Yeah, one more positive thing about the Hunter here is having an easier time dealing with the Tank Buster here in the last boss as well, right? Having that Hunter pet taunting of the Spirit Breaker, the tank ability, is going to be so helpful for the tanks, just relieving so much pressure off the tank, not having this debuff that you need to deal with. The tank taunt, the pet taunt, sorry, is just so useful. Having that safety of having the Hunter here is also just very helpful, and that's maybe a reason why Pain for Femme did have to deal with the Tank Breaker and did have to actually play that Awakened mob, because maybe without the Hunter they're not able to pull it off with the last boss.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, they've also dealt with 3 of the Awakened mobs so far in this dungeon. The only one left is the one that you can see on their screen in that back left corner there. So I'd be interested to see if they have enough time to do it. If they're just going to go for all 4 Awakened mobs before getting to the final boss, that would be interesting.
Yeah, that would be very inefficient, but I assume they're going to do what I said earlier. I think they're just going to go back into the realm afterwards, walk through to the last boss, and have a rogue or something engage the last boss so they get pulled out. If they do anything else, I'm just going to be disappointed, because I don't think we've seen a single team engage the last boss yet without a single Awakened mob. I don't think that happened at all, and I also think that should not be happening in this tournament, because it's in the end, it's just inefficient to deal with every single Awakened mob, because the amount of time you lose single targeting down the Awakened mobs in the other realm, it's so inefficient because you can't pull any trash on top. Yes, you can make use of the portals and maybe skip some trash that you wouldn't be able to skip otherwise, but that's more of a live server thing. For those tournaments, it's really inefficient having to deal with them because you just can't pull anything on top, and that's the biggest problem with it.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of things that shouldn't have happened in this, there's a lot of things that shouldn't have been happening in this series that have happened, but we're going to swiftly be moving on that. As the boys get to the intermission phase with the boss at 50%, they'll just have to deal with these pillars, and then they'll be home free from 50% to 0. Fim has died on the skip for Pain for Fim. They'll have to get a quick res off on him as well, and I think they did pretty much what you mentioned. It looks like they just shadow mode skipped by things with Fim dying instead of going through the realm, which is weird, right? They shouldn't do that. They should have gone for the realm skip like you mentioned. They wouldn't have had any deaths had they did that. So I wonder, what the reasoning behind that was. Maybe they were scared of having a rogue pull the boss or something? I'm not quite sure.
Maybe they planned on Fem not actually getting in combat and dying, because theoretically it is going to be faster not to use the realm, because the cast time that you need to click on the portal and everything like that is going to be slightly slower to use the realm if you don't have anyone die, right? So maybe they wanted to have the rogue maybe pull the last pack away and Fem walking past without getting in combat, something like that. Not really sure. Either way, it definitely cost them another 5 seconds here for Fem dying. And the boys, on the other hand, they're already in 30% off the last boss here, and they dealt with the Awakened mobs fine. They had their Boralus available to deal with them, and unfortunately, Pain for Fem having 2 people go down here at the start.
Yeah, this is not ideal for sure. They do have the 2 battle roses to get them up, but at this point, there's no catching up. The boys have the boss at 10%. The boys look like they're firmly in control of this dungeon, and the boys, once again, just getting right back to their ways, pulling it all together after that really unfortunate siege of Boralus, making sure they get back to their clean cool, controlled ways. Only one death in this Motherload, and it was a planned death, mind you, because their tank didn't have Shadow Meld. The boys are going to be moving on to the lower bracket final against Perplexed, taking the series 2-1.
That's right, the boys just completely forgetting about any of those mistakes that might have been made in the Siege